Long before modern civilization learned to control societies through written laws, surveillance, and centralized institutions, the ancient societies of North America had already developed an invisible but highly effective system of power that operated quietly through sex, belief, and social consequence. In these civilizations, sexuality was never treated as a private indulgence, casual pleasure, or moral weakness, but as a force that shaped lineage, authority, survival, and collective balance. Because sex produced children, children formed bloodlines, bloodlines determined inheritance, inheritance defined leadership, and leadership decided whether a society endured or collapsed. This understanding meant that intimacy was inseparable from politics and was never left unmanaged, yet it was also not simply suppressed, because these societies understood that desire could not be erased without creating instability, so instead, they acknowledged its power and structured it through kinship rules, rituals, taboos, and spiritual meanings that transformed control into tradition rather than coercion. What often appears to modern observers as sexual freedom was in reality guided freedom, carefully balanced to prevent jealousy, conflict, and social fracture, because unchecked desire could disrupt alliances, confuse lineage, and weaken communal trust. Elders, shamans, clan mothers, and spiritual authorities governed sexuality not through prisons or punishment, but through belief, defining which relationships were sacred, dangerous, permitted, or forbidden. And when sexuality carried spiritual and communal consequences, discipline became internal rather than external, as individuals feared harming the community, offending ancestors, or disturbing unseen forces believed to sustain life itself. Lineage systems ensured that reproduction was never socially neutral, since every child entered a network of obligations shaping land rights, ritual roles, inheritance, and political legitimacy, while marriage functioned less as romance and more as strategy, binding families, redistributing resources, and stabilizing alliances, with sexual exclusivity, providing clarity rather than moral purity, because in societies without written contracts, the body itself became a living agreement whose violation produced confusion rather than sin. Gender roles within these systems were complex and often fluid, as many indigenous societies recognized spiritually defined identities beyond rigid binaries and integrated them into ceremonial and social authority, not as rebellion but as classification, since naming a role was a way to maintain order and balance. Control over female sexuality, often misread only as oppression, sometimes translated into authority in matrilineal societies where elder women governed lineage, marriage decisions, and continuity, although power always remained uneven and conformity was still required for survival. Sexual norms shifted during war, famine, or migration, expanding or contracting as conditions demanded, revealing a pragmatic understanding that desire influences behavior at scale. European colonizers failed to recognize these systems and dismissed difference as immorality, not realizing that indigenous societies moralized sex through consequence rather than shame, acknowledging desire openly while managing it communally, unlike European systems that privatized intimacy only to obsess over it secretly. The true destruction began when colonial powers deliberately targeted sexual norms, because controlling intimacy meant dismantling kinship networks, inheritance systems, spiritual authority, and identity itself, allowing domination without constant force. So when rituals were banned, relationships redefined, and family structures altered, entire systems of governance collapsed quietly. Seen through this lens, sex in ancient North America was not a marginal or sensational subject, but a central mechanism of power, revealing that these societies understood a truth modern cultures often forget: that desire is never purely personal, it is political, and whoever controls its meaning silently controls the future of a people. As these ancient North American societies matured and expanded, the systems built around sex, power, and control became even more refined and psychologically precise, revealing that sexuality was not only a biological function, but a method through which obedience, belonging, and hierarchy were quietly engineered, because when a culture teaches its people how to desire, when to desire, and whom to desire, it does far more than regulate intimacy. It shapes identity itself, and identity once shaped becomes the most reliable form of control, since individuals begin to discipline themselves long before authority ever intervenes. Rituals surrounding puberty were among the most powerful tools in this process because they marked the moment when the body stopped belonging only to the individual and became accountable to the community, the ancestors, and the spiritual order, teaching young people that desire was neither shameful nor free, but conditional, activated only within meanings assigned by tradition. And these rituals did not rely on fear alone, but on belonging, because to follow the rules meant acceptance, status, and spiritual alignment, while to violate them meant isolation, loss of voice, and symbolic death within the social world. Sexual punishment in these cultures was rarely physical, yet deeply effective, operating through exclusion from ceremonies, denial of marriage opportunities, withdrawal of communal support, or the belief that spiritual imbalance would bring illness or misfortune, consequences that were slow, invisible, and therefore far more terrifying than immediate violence, ensuring conformity without resistance. Those who controlled ritual knowledge, myths, and spiritual interpretation controlled the moral universe itself, deciding which desires were natural, which were dangerous, and which were unthinkable, and in doing so, they governed behavior without appearing to govern at all. Over generations, this created societies where power rarely needed to assert itself because obedience was already internalized, embedded in stories told to children, warnings whispered to adolescents, and expectations carried silently into adulthood. When European colonization entered this world, it encountered not chaos, but an alternative order, one that colonial authorities instinctively perceived as a threat because it operated independently of church, crown, and written law, and they understood that to dominate these societies, they had to dismantle their most intimate foundations, which is why colonization targeted sexuality with obsessive precision, criminalizing traditional relationships, outlawing ceremonies, redefining gender roles, enforcing foreign marriage systems, and replacing communal regulation of desire with private guilt and institutional punishment. This was not merely cultural interference, but strategic psychological warfare, because once indigenous systems of sexual governance were destroyed, kinship networks fractured, lineage lost clarity, spiritual authority collapsed, and individuals were left isolated from the very structures that once gave their bodies meaning, making control easier without constant force. The devastation that followed was then used as justification, with colonizers pointing to social breakdown as evidence of inferiority, ignoring that the breakdown was engineered through deliberate disruption of identity itself. Yet power leaves residues, and even as these ancient systems were violently dismantled, their psychological logic did not disappear, instead lingering beneath the surface of modern societies in unspoken discomforts, inherited fears, and moral contradictions surrounding sex, authority, and control, suggesting that while cultures change, the mechanisms of power evolve rather than vanish. The most unsettling realization is that modern societies often believe themselves liberated simply because control is less visible, yet they continue to regulate desire through norms, shame, status, and identity in ways that mirror ancient systems almost perfectly, proving that the oldest form of power does not rely on chains or commands, but on teaching people what to want, what to fear, and what to consider normal. In this sense, the story of sex, power, and control in ancient North America is not a closed chapter of history, but a warning written across centuries, showing that when desire becomes structured, power becomes permanent, and when people defend the rules that shape their own bodies, believing them to be natural or chosen, authority no longer needs to rule openly because it is already moved inside the mind. where it waits patiently, unquestioned, and almost impossible to see, until the rare moment someone pauses and asks not who controls society, but who taught us to desire the way we do, and whether that lesson was ever truly ours to begin with.